Let me ask you something. What if the very first sentence you ever learned about American history was wrong? Not just simplified, not just incomplete, wrong in the way that matters most. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus discovered America. You learned that in school. Maybe your kids are learning it right now. It rolls off the tongue like a nursery rhyme. Clean, tidy, settled. But here is what nobody told you in that classroom. On the morning Columbus stepped off that ship, many historians estimate that somewhere between 60 and 100 million people were already living across the Americas. Entire civilizations, cities, trade networks, philosophy, medicine. You cannot discover a land where tens of millions of people already live. So if that first sentence is wrong, what else have we been told incorrectly? Buckle in, because what we are about to walk through together, from 1492 all the way to 1900, is 4 centuries of ambition, blood, brilliance, and contradiction. This is not the sanitized version. This is not the villain versus hero version either. This is the complex, documented, historically grounded story of how the most powerful nation on earth was actually built. And trust me, it is far more fascinating and far more disturbing than anything you were taught in school. Before we talk about Columbus, we need to talk about who was already there. This channel is brand new, and we need your support to grow. If this content speaks to you, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Every action you take helps us reach more people. Now let's get into it. The Taino people had been living in the Caribbean for centuries, not in primitive shelters scratching at the dirt, but in organized, functional, sophisticated societies. They cultivated vu, sweet potatoes, and corn. They constructed dugout canoes sturdy enough to navigate open water between islands. They had chiefs called caciques, complex spiritual traditions, and a working trade economy. When Columbus arrived on October 12, 1492, he did not land in an empty world. He landed in someone else's home. His own journal tells the story. Columbus wrote about the Taino with what sounds like genuine admiration, describing them as generous, peaceful, and welcoming. And then, in that same journal entry, he wrote words that would shape the next 5 centuries. They would make fine servants. Think about that. In the same breath as praising their kindness, he was calculating how to use them. Columbus was a man under contract. The Spanish crown had financed his voyage with very specific expectations: gold, spices, trade routes to Asia, and proof of return on investment. When Asia did not materialize and gold was not flowing, the pressure mounted fast. Historical records document that in 1495, he rounded up approximately 1,500 Taino men, women, and children. Around 500 were shipped to Spain as enslaved people. Roughly 200 died during the crossing alone. On the island of Hispaniola, he imposed a tribute system requiring every Taino adult to deliver a fixed quota of gold every 3 months. Those who failed faced brutal punishment. That is not legend. That is documented. His own contemporaries recorded it. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, many historians estimate the Taino population had been reduced to near extinction through disease, forced labor, starvation, and direct violence working together over decades. Was Columbus uniquely evil or a product of a system? The honest answer is both things can be true simultaneously. Every major European power in this era was locked in a race for resources, territory, and dominance. Columbus was the instrument. The system was the engine. And the system was just getting started. Colonization was not chaotic. It was organized. The Spanish developed an entire legal structure called the encomienda system, granting settlers authority over the labor of indigenous people. In theory, settlers provided Christian instruction in return. In practice, it was forced labor with a paperwork trail. The most prominent critic was Bartolomé de las Casas, who had initially participated in the system himself before becoming its loudest opponent. His 1542 work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, was a first-hand witness report presented directly to Spanish King Charles I demanding reform. Reform came slowly. The abuses continued. European ships also carried microorganisms indigenous populations had never encountered: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Many historians now estimate that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within the first century of sustained European contact. Some scholars place the total death toll between 50 and 55 million people, possibly the largest demographic collapse in recorded human history. When we talk about European colonization of the Americas, we are talking about one of the most consequential events in all of human history. Now let's move north to English colonization, where the American story specifically begins to take shape. 3 ships carrying 104 English settlers establish a colony at Jamestown, Virginia. It is by almost every measure a disaster. The settlers arrived too late to plant crops. Many were gentlemen who had never performed manual labor. The site was swampy, the water brackish, the mosquitoes relentless. By January of 1608, barely 38 of the original 104 colonists were still alive. They survived through an uncomfortable reality the romantic version of history always glosses over. They were saved, repeatedly, by the Powhatan Confederacy. Powhatan, paramount chief of a sophisticated alliance of Algonquian-speaking peoples, saw potential for strategic advantage in helping the English. For a brief window, there was genuine documented coexistence. But here is what changed everything. Tobacco. John Rolfe cultivated a strain of tobacco the European market craved. By 1617, Virginia was exporting 20,000 pounds annually. By 1629, that number was 500,000 pounds per year. Tobacco was extraordinarily profitable, and it required enormous amounts of land, Powhatan land. The Powhatan Wars of 1610 to 1646 systematically dismantled the Confederacy. By 1646, the chiefdom that had sustained English survival in its most desperate hours had been reduced to tributary status on its own ancestral territory. This pattern, cooperation followed by dispossession, would repeat itself across the continent for 250 years. Slavery did not arrive in North America fully formed. It evolved. In the early decades, Virginia's primary labor force was indentured servants, poor English men and women who signed contracts committing to 4 to 7 years of labor in exchange for passage and eventually a land grant. Working conditions were brutal. Many died before their contracts expired. By the 1670s, Virginia had thousands of landless, frustrated, armed former servants with nothing to lose. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon organized an armed uprising. What alarmed Virginia's ruling class most was who was fighting together: poor white former servants and enslaved black Africans, united against the established order. The rebellion was suppressed, but sent an unmistakable signal. The indentured servant system was a political time bomb. Their solution, documented in the colonial legal record, was to systematically racialize slavery. Enslaved status became permanent and hereditary. Interracial marriage was criminalized. White was constructed as a legal category conferring social privileges even on poor white people with no stake in the plantation system. The scholar W.E.B. Du Bois called this the wages of whiteness, the psychological benefits of racial status offered as compensation for economic exploitation. By 1700, the framework of American racial slavery was in place. It would endure and expand for another 165 years. The American Revolution was real, historically important, and deeply contradictory, all at the same time. The French and Indian War had been enormously expensive, and Parliament decided the colonies should help shoulder the debt. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767. From London, these were reasonable revenue measures. From the colonists' perspective, unconstitutional. No taxation without representation. In 1765, that was genuinely radical. The men leading this resistance were wealthy merchants, lawyers, and large landowners. Men like John H. Hancock had strong financial incentives to oppose British trade restrictions beyond any constitutional principle. The revolution was driven by genuine principle and economic self-interest simultaneously. The Boston Massacre of March 5, 1770, 5 people killed by British soldiers, was weaponized brilliantly by colonial activists. Paul Revere's famous engraving simplified a complicated event into a galvanizing symbol. Here is what you need to understand about political messaging. It doesn't have to be entirely false to be effective. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence over 17 days in June of 1776. The document contained one of the most powerful sentences in political history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But who did all men actually include? Jefferson owned approximately 600 enslaved people. At the moment he wrote those words, roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans were held in bondage across the 13 colonies. Jefferson's original draft condemned King George for perpetuating the slave trade. It was removed at the insistence of delegates from Carolina and Georgia. The British writer Samuel Johnson asked, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" He had a point. Stop and sit with that. The same men signing documents about liberty were legally owning other human beings. And the people they owned were running toward the enemy, because the enemy had offered them something the founders would not. Freedom. This is not a footnote. This is the center of the story. In November of 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, offered freedom to any enslaved person who joined British forces. Thousands responded. The revolution meant entirely different things depending on who you were. What ultimately saved the revolution was France, motivated by the desire to weaken Britain, not by love of republican ideals. The French Navy trapped British General Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781, forcing surrender. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized American independence. The United States Constitution was never supposed to be written. The delegates in Philadelphia in 1787 were sent to revise the Articles of Confederation. What they produced instead was an entirely new document. In complete secrecy, windows nailed shut, guards at the doors. The Constitution was genuinely innovative in design, but it contained compromises its authors privately acknowledged were morally indefensible. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for congressional representation, giving slaveholding states outsized power for the next 77 years. The Constitution also prohibited banning the international slave trade until 1808. James Madison's son predicted the slavery question had only been deferred. He was right. It would take approximately 600,000 deaths to resolve it. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the United States overnight. But did France actually own that land? The territory was inhabited by dozens of nations, the Eso, Sage, Pawna, Mandan, Hitisu, Arvara, and many others, none of whom had ever ceded sovereignty. France sold land it did not control to a country that had not yet reached it. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 under President J.K. Sun was the result. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, had adapted to American settler society on its own terms. The Cherokee developed a written language through the Scholars Kwaya, a tribal newspaper, a republican constitution, and schools. By every criterion the government used to define civilization, they qualified. None of it mattered. Between 1836 and 1839, approximately 16,000 Cherokee were forcibly marched to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. An estimated 4,000 died from exposure, disease, and starvation. The Cherokee named it Inuina Dal Tiesone, the trail where they cried. These were families, elderly people, children, marched at gunpoint from their homes in winter. To understand why the Civil War happened, you have to understand cotton economics, not the politics, the money. In 1793, Eli W. Taino invented the cotton gin. By 1860, American cotton represented roughly 60% of all American exports. The roughly 4 million enslaved people in the American South represented the single largest capital investment in the United States, approximately $3 billion, exceeding the combined worth of every American factory and railroad combined. Slavery was structurally central to the entire North Atlantic economy. Between 1820 and 1860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were forcibly transported from the Upper South to new plantations in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. 1 million people torn from family, from community, from everything they had ever known. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line. Slavery permitted South, prohibited North. It held for 24 years. The Compromise of 1850 included a Fugitive Slave Act requiring citizens in free states to assist in returning escaped enslaved people. The option of moral neutrality was erased by law. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became the second best-selling book of the 19th century behind only the Bible, moving people in ways political arguments had not. The 1857 Dred Scott decision declared African Americans were not citizens and Congress had no authority to ban slavery anywhere in the territories. Slavery could expand everywhere and no democratic process could stop it. Abraham Lincoln stated it clearly, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He won the presidency in 1860. 11 states left the Union within months. Their own secession documents answer the question of why. Mississippi declared, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Confederate Vice President Alexander S. Stephens called slavery the cornerstone of the new government. His words, on the record, "The Civil War began April 12, 1861. The Battle of Antietam produced 23,000 casualties in a single day, the bloodiest in American military history. The Battle of Gettysburg produced 51,000 casualties and marked the turning point of the war. By its conclusion, between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers were dead, more than World War I and World War II combined. Nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army, risking execution or re-enslavement if captured. They fought anyway. Approximately 40,000 died. The war ended with Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It had taken 250 years and the bloodiest war in American history to legally end what began on the shores of Virginia in 1619. Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, was the closest the United States had ever come to fulfilling its founding promises for all its citizens. Black men voted in substantial numbers for the first time. Some were elected to public office. Hyrum Revels of Mississippi filled the Senate seat Jefferson Davis had vacated to lead the Confederacy. African American communities rebuilt family structures slavery had destroyed, built churches, schools, and civic institutions from the ground up. The Ku Klux Klan systematically destroyed it, assassinating office holders, burning schools, massacring voters. The Colfax Massacre in Louisiana in 1873 left 150 black men dead. A backroom deal in 1876 gave R.O. Thursdayford Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. Reconstruction was over. Jim Crow laws mandated segregation across every sphere of public life. By 1900, black voter registration in Mississippi had fallen from over 90% to approximately 6%. The civil rights struggles of the 20th century were fighting to achieve what Reconstruction had briefly promised and then ripped away. While the South navigated the aftermath of war, the North became an industrial titan. American industrial output grew by an estimated 400% between 1860 and 1900. Andrew Carnegie's steel operations in Pittsburgh exceeded the combined output of Britain and Germany. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining before being broken up in 1911 as an illegal monopoly. These men, Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Corliss Vanderbilt, were called captains of industry by admirers and robber barons by those who saw what their rise cost ordinary people. Both descriptions captured something true. 20 million immigrants entered between 1880 and 1920, working 12-hour days in dangerous conditions. Strikes erupted. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the H.O.H. Hempstead Strike of 1892, the Pullman Strike of 1894. The federal government sided with capital every time. Mark Twain named it the Gilded Age. Gilded, not golden, gleaming on the surface, something else entirely underneath. From 1492 to 1900, 4 centuries. The gap between stated ideals and actual practice has been the defining tension of the American experience. Columbus sailed under the language of discovery and created systems of bondage. The founders declared all men created equal while enslaving hundreds of thousands. The Constitution established democratic governance while protecting slavery within its own text. The nation proclaimed manifeste destiny while removing indigenous nations from their homelands. Industrial capitalism created unprecedented wealth and unprecedented exploitation simultaneously. At every stage, voices challenged these contradictions. The Taino who resisted Columbus. Bartolomé de las Casas, who documented colonial atrocities at personal risk. Frederick Dugilus, Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Gabriel Praw Sir, enslaved people who escaped, organized, and refused dehumanization. The Cherokee, who fought removal through courts before being marched from their homes anyway. The factory workers who struck against the most powerful men on earth. The Reconstruction-era black legislators serving under constant threat of assassination. The abolitionist women who noticed the language of liberty applied poorly to themselves. Power in America has never gone unchallenged. Not for a single generation. Nations built on contradiction carry within them, always, the seeds of their own transformation. The Declaration of Independence said something so powerful, all men are created equal, that it could not be permanently contained to the men who wrote it. Those words were taken up by abolitionists, by suffragists, by civil rights leaders, by every generation that refused to accept the distance between the promise and the reality is final. The contradiction was the engine. America was built by ambition and sustained by exploitation. It declared freedom and practiced exclusion. It produced brilliant founding documents and spent generations failing to live by them. And yet in every era, it also produced people who refused to accept that failure as permanent. Understanding this is not about guilt and not about pride. It is about clarity. You cannot repair what you refuse to honestly understand. You cannot build something lasting on a foundation you will not honestly examine. For centuries, one nation, built on ideas that were genuinely beautiful and systems that were genuinely brutal, and still in the process of becoming what it once declared it would be. The story is not over. It is being written right now in classrooms, courtrooms, voting booths, and public squares across this country. History does not belong to the past. It belongs to whoever is willing to know it. And now, you know where it started. If this documentary changed how you see American history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more long-form historical documentaries that go beyond the textbook, because the full story always matters.